So Friedrich Nietzsche was the person who, whenever you hear the phrase God is dead, he was the original proponent of that concept. And God is dead refers to the fact that Nietzsche saw his culture, his worldview was indicating how religion was on the decline. And people were starting to lose faith in these religious institutions that for centuries and millennia had been the ultimate capital T absolute truth. And so as we started walking away from these religious institutions, we essentially have entered into a modern meaning crisis. And Nietzsche was kind of, a lot of people would say, ahead of his time in recognizing this meaning crisis and realizing that if God, or this deity from on high, was not the one handing down appropriate morality and justification for our actions, etc., we would be falling into this idea of nihilism, which is the recognition that the universe, the world, is inherently meaningless and that we therefore create our own meaning. Now, at first glance, Nietzsche's the concept of nihilism can be a bit pessimistic, and a lot of people can kind of fall into the trap of pessimistic nihilism. But Nietzsche's main point really was the argument that now that we recognize that God is dead and that we create our own meaning, it really is up to us to create a new concept of meaning and a value system that benefits society, but also our own personal fulfillment, because when we are personally fulfilled, we are better participants in our local communities and society itself. So with that in mind, like Nietzsche was very much like not interested in maintaining religious institutions as the gatekeeper for morality and institutional control, essentially. So in that sense, maybe he was not as MAGA, since Trump supporters notoriously relied on the Trump presidency notoriously relied on the support of churchgoers and Christians in the United States, particularly white evangelical Christians, and mobilizing that base through the mouthpiece of the religious leaders in the pulpits, who were essentially butt buddies with the political leaders in their areas. Everyone on the top was giving each other money and power, and everyone in the church congregation was being lied to and told to vote for this guy who promised to save them, since, as we know, Christians are unfortunately programmed to, this is not an attack on Christians, but Christians are unfortunately programmed and conditioned to believe in savior figures. How I see it is the threat of religion is no longer sufficient to control our behavior, so we need to really work on our beliefs intentionally. Very well put. Yes, so I'm curious. Now we are going to see Philosophy Tube's YouTube video supposedly answering the question, was Nietzsche MAGA? Okay, I'm super excited. Here we go.
I have a friend who I'm pretty sure voted for Donald Trump, and right before Christmas he was upset because his daughter supported Harris and she didn't want her Republican relatives around for the holidays. My friend couldn't understand this perspective. He said that politics is personal and you should never shun someone, least of all a family member, for their personal choice. On the flip side, his daughter couldn't understand his perspective. How could you put somebody's choice to vote Trump off to one side? Like, it just doesn't even matter at all. I think we can explain this conflict with a little bit of help from 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. In fact, I think we can explain a lot of the MAGA movement generally using Nietzsche's work, so here we go. Some people think that morality shouldn't come into business. That, hey, whatever right and wrong says, you just gotta do what's right for the company. So they still believe in morality, they just have a different belief about when it applies. Similarly, my Trump voting friend doesn't lack morals. He's not an animal. When he says politics is personal, he just means that there isn't a universal moral standard. There's no one way that everybody should vote, just a diversity of opinions. His daughter evidently disagrees and thinks there is a universal moral standard that applies in every voting booth, that voting Republican in this particular election at least was morally wrong, and she doesn't want to associate with anyone who did. So it's not that she has morals and he doesn't. They both have morals. The disagreement is about when they should come into play. Now, for Nietzsche, it is a mistake to think that morality is universal and applies to everyone all the time. He was quite comfortable saying that for some people, the rules are just different, especially if they are a better class of person. We just did a video about that. If you're curious, you can go and...
Yes, chat. Okay, we're already chatting. I love it. Hello, first time chatter. Nietzsche was anti-Nazi. I doubt he'd be pro-Trump. That's a great point. So the Nazis actually actively used a lot of Nietzsche's ideas kind of against his, well, actually against his will. The concept of Überman, which is, I think that's the word, translated to Superman, which is Nietzsche's essentially like idealized concept of this self-value creating, self-actualized being who has rejected all of the institutionalized religious morality and has instead created his own value system. The Nazis actively used this concept, which is supposed to be like Nietzsche intended this as a way of saying nobody is better than anyone else. We all just need to become the best versions of our individual selves. He was not a eugenicist by any stretch of the imagination, but the Nazis kind of co-opted this concept of the Übermen and then translated it to, oh, all Germans and Aryans are the embodiment of the Übermen. And that was, one, factually incorrect, and two, a horrific crime against humanity. So to say that because he was anti-Nazi, he'd be pro-Trump, that's a valid point. Again, I'm just going back to after reading Nietzsche and seeing how he talks about women. I mean, you know, so many of the philosophers that we still revere to this day, patriarchy was not really as recognized at the time. Like, maybe it's not fair for me to just write off Nietzsche because of how he talked about women in the book I read of his. But yeah, priest is male. Okay, so Male Rights USA says that the priest is male to represent Christ, who was human male. Misogyny does not exist in the church. I would argue by saying that misogyny exists in general because misogyny exists in the church.
Check it out. Now, my Trump voting friend is not a white supremacist. In fact, he's black. But he does believe in hierarchy, I think it's fair to say. He thinks he has some authority over his daughter, especially whilst he's still supporting her. He might not call it authority. He might say that he has a responsibility to raise her right and prepare her for the world and so on, but it's clear that he expects some amount of deference from her as part of that relationship, and he regards that deference as flowing naturally to him, despite the fact that his daughter is, in fact, an adult. In other words, in his mind, there is a hierarchy, and so the rules are different. Morality doesn't always apply, and if there's a disagreement about when it does, he should have the final say because he's the dad. If you're more inclined to view everybody as equal, then you might not have a problem with saying, no, actually the rules are the same for everyone and there is a universal moral standard, but that is not the way that Nietzsche would look at it. Here's another example. Nancy Mace, US representative for North Carolina. She said some very nasty things about trans people and tried to have us banned from using public bathrooms. She was confronted in her office by AOC. And AOC said, hey, don't you think this is kind of bad? Don't you think this is kind of hurtful? I mean, you shouldn't say those things about trans people, right? And Nancy Mace replied, whatever, you know, it's a game. Points on the board. To me, that doesn't suggest a lack of morality so much as a disagreement about when it applies and to whom. To AOC, morality obviously applies to trans people. Like, you shouldn't say those sorts of horrible things about us or try and have our rights restricted. But to Nancy Mace, apparently, we don't really come under the scope of morality. It's just a game. Points on the board. Now, it would be nice if we could all just agree to disagree about whether morality applies to, say, voting. It would be nice if families around the world could come together over the holidays and not fight about stuff. But there is a universal standard that we are all bound by. There is something that affects every single one of us, and that is the amount of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. I think about this quite often, that some of the classic philosophers we still read today were writing at a time when people didn't know about global warming. I mean, it's all well and good to champion individuality and individual perspectives, but we do, in fact, all live on one very precarious planet, and our actions, including voting, do have an effect on whether or not it remains habitable. It certainly seems like some things should matter from everybody's perspective. I mean, isn't that just science? Well, here's a little story about science. In December of last year, I was in Montana, which is a part of planet Earth. I went into a tea shop in Montana, and whilst I was waiting for my order, I eavesdropped on the conversation that the couple next to me were having. Apologies if you were that couple, your conversation was just too fascinating not to listen in on. They were talking about vaccines. The woman was saying that she didn't trust vaccines, she didn't want her kids to get any vaccines, and here's some quotes of things she actually said that I surreptitiously wrote down in my phone. You trust Western medicine because it's worked for you? But for me, Western medicine killed my mum. I trust my kids' bodies to do what they're meant to do. I'm Cherokee. My ancestors were Cherokee, so I'm very in touch with nature and natural healing. People say to me, oh, you reject science? You want polio to come back? And they're so stupid. Polio was cured because we cleaned up the water. It wasn't the vaccine, so I actually know more science than you. That last point is false, by the way. The cleaning up the water did help with the polio situation, but we did actually beat polio with a vaccine. I'd be doing misinformation if I didn't tell you that. I was really struck by how often that woman centered herself and her own perspective in the conversation they were having. All of the things she said were about her identity as a woman, as a daughter, as a mother, as a person of Indigenous American descent. Even that last remark about polio was about her in contrast to some imaginary other person who knew less than her. She talked a lot more about herself than she did about things like facts or evidence or studies, and I'm not necessarily bashing her for that, I'm just noticing it and saying that it's interesting. Philosophers might call that Perspectivism. And we find a lot of it in Friedrich Nietzsche. Facts.
So that brings up an interesting point. What Philosophy Tube was saying about how a lot of the philosophers that we revere who have historically been so impactful in shaping society and culture, I think that it was so easy for, first of all, them as men to center their conversations around self-actualization. And we even see this play out in modern self-help books geared toward men. How the self-actualization and becoming the best, well, I guess we see this across the board in self-help book, particularly in the westernized United States, because individualization has become so valued. And this is too, unfortunately, there might be some very innocent intentions with talking about individualization. I think especially for women, individualization can be a balancing act against the community-based, empathy-based, caretaking-based conditioning that women grow up with here in the United States. But I do think that on the whole, the westernized United States and its focus on individualization has led to so much loneliness. It can be a contributing factor in the male loneliness epidemic. And also, there could be a serious factor of intentional manufacturing of individualization on behalf of the controlling ultra-rich to keep us individualized and disconnected from each other, because the less organized we are in our communities, the less we are able to band together and rise up and speak out for our rights and just maintain these lifestyles of autonomous, with all of my boundaries and ideal, self-actualized contribution to this economy that benefits them. So I do think it's really important to remember that a lot of the philosophers and historians and all of these men who were academics in the past in human history that we have come to revere, even Albert Einstein wasn't really fair in giving his wife credit for the amount of research that she contributed to his work, legitimate scholarly research. She doesn't really get a footnote until we discovered later how much she participated in his work. And so I think it's important to remember, even Friedrich Nietzsche had a more limited perspective than we do now. And whereas it's more important now than ever that we band together in collectiveness and in inclusivity. So I think that was a really interesting point by Philosophy Tube.
And science only matter from somebody's personal perspective. The value of truth is not unconditional. The value of a fact depends on what you want to do with it. Here's some quotes from Friedrich Nietzsche's book, The Will to Power. There is no truth. The concept truth is nonsensical. There are no facts, only interpretations. Now, you might well say, well, that's just ridiculous, and it's also self-refuting, and you're risking throwing away so much of what humanity has achieved through science and reason. But a Nietzschean would come back and say, no, truth is only meaningful in contexts shaped by our desires, and desire is what life is really about. To deny that is to deny what it means to be alive. In very general terms, Nietzsche thought that society has gone wrong. We're all being held back and kept down by dominant standards of morality. And the cure for this is to try and have a personal psychological transformation, become an individual, and assert yourself. Perspectivism is part of that project. Here is another example. Now, you might say that under President Joe Biden, the United States had the best post-COVID economic recovery of any G7 nation. You might say that under Biden, the US economy was pretty good, all things considered, relative to other countries and relative to what it might have been. But a Nietzschean would say, I don't care what the macroeconomic picture says when groceries, gasoline, rent, and health insurance cost most of my wages. Yes, those things are facts, they are true, I'm not denying that, but that truth doesn't matter to what I want to do. There's this trend I've seen where liberals say that Trump supporters are nihilist, that they don't care about anything. But Perspectivism isn't nihilism. They do care about some things. Again, like my Trump voting friend doesn't lack values, he just doesn't value all the same things at the same time as me. And if you try to impose values on people as if they are objective, if you try to say, you have to care about these facts, a lot of people experience that as belittling. When we think about freedom and ask, what is freedom? A Nietzschean would say it has two parts to it. Firstly, freedom means seeing your values, your goals, your intentions, and what you want to do as coming from you, chosen by you, rather than given to you by someone else. Secondly, freedom means the ability to reflect on those values and goals and change them if you want to. So now I'm thinking about pronouns and how a lot of conservatives can get upset about compelled speech when they're asked to use trans-inclusive language. Over the last few years, there's been a greater recognition that queer people exist and that, hello, we're part of society. Hi, nice to see you. We've been here the whole time. And that includes, making a few accommodations so that life is a little bit easier for us. And some conservatives have gotten very upset about that. They see it as something being forced down their throats. Like, it's the new religion, it's the new woke orthodoxy. Say the damn pronouns. According to Nietzsche, every living thing has this drive inside called the will to power. Maybe a better translation would be will to agency or will to freedom. Will to power is the translation that everybody knows, but the idea is that we all want to feel like we are in control of our lives. We all want to feel like we're powerful and strong and the masters of our own destinies. There are lots of ways to fulfill the will to power. Dominating somebody else through violence is a very, very obvious way, but Nietzsche thought there are more subtle ways too. Pity and charity are, according to him, expressions of the will to power. If you help somebody out, you're really just trying to reassure yourself of your own superior status, and you could even call that virtue signaling. Nietzsche was an egoist. He didn't believe in unselfish actions. Even things that look ostensibly altruistic are, according to him, secretly selfish all along. Your mileage may vary on whether or not you believe that. I see a lot of conservatives who seem to think that liberals are pulling some kind of con, whether it's an explicit conspiracy like QAnon or like putting stuff in the vaccines, or whether it's just virtue signaling. They say stuff like, well, you don't really care about global warming or vaccines or queer people or inclusive language. You don't really care about any of those things. You're just using your will to power. It's just a secret ploy for control. And you cloak your will to power in self-righteous moral language, but I see right through you. That's a Nietzschean outlook. They're trying to explain society in terms of the will to power. They're analyzing ideologies like progressivism and trying to tell a story about where they come from and why they're secretly bad. There's this other...
I do want to, quick side note about the pronouns thing. Number one, pronouns wouldn't matter to Christian conservatives so much if they didn't base their entire belief system on gendering the deity of the entire known universe as he, him, and therefore profiting off of the patriarchal hierarchy of men subjugating women. So there's that. Also, when it comes to just like a day-to-day decency towards people being called whatever they want to be called, a lot of the argument behind why someone doesn't want to use someone else's chosen pronouns is because of the argument. So if I were a conservative, I would say, well, I don't believe that you can change your gender. So it would be unfair to make me change my beliefs just to respect someone else's beliefs. I'm living how I want to live, which is to say that I don't believe you can change genders and I don't believe you can change pronouns. My response to that is that I don't believe that it is appropriate for a woman to take her husband's last name. And that's going to ruffle some feathers even among modern feminists. But I very much maintain that changing the last name to suit the man's in a heteronormative wedding ceremony, it props up the antiquated purchasing of women as brides to further the male lineage. And I understand the argument of, we want a cohesive name for our family unit when we start having kids. And if that were actually the case, it would be common to choose between a man's last name and a woman's last name, or maybe they start a new family name matched together. Like, even hyphenating a woman's last name to me is not enough to fight back against the antiquated system of purchasing women as if they were cattle. However, whenever I am approached by any woman who has changed her last name to match her husband's, I am going to call her by her chosen last name, even though I fundamentally disagree with that concept. Okay, because it is a matter of decency. It is a matter of respect. And so if people can't get over someone else's chosen pronouns, I am going to call out that maybe this is not about morality. It is about decency. Because again, these people are likely changing their last names to suit their husband, to match their husbands. And I disagree with that, but I will still, out of the kindness and compassion of being a participant in this world that is already complex enough without causing this bullshit, I will still give them the respect they deserve and call them by the last name that they prefer to be called by. Thank you so much. Kayse, wait till you meet the man of your dreams. I will personally remind me of this after I take his last name. That's so funny because I can tell you're like maybe trying to be kind, maybe, but the man of my dreams, Male Rights USA, the man of my dreams would not expect me to take his last name. He would fucking know better. At the very least, he might take my last name. How about that, Male Rights USA? I can't. You guys, it's so funny. I can't.
Another trend I've seen where liberals and leftists paint Trump supporters as cruel, as delighting in cruelty and causing suffering, and they often point out things like Donald Trump has promised to take retribution against his enemies. But on the flip side, I see some MAGA people portraying that as kind of a good thing, as a willingness to be tough that in some sense aligns with reality. Like, yeah, it's tough, but you gotta be that way sometimes, or it's the discipline that people need, or in some way at least it's an understandable instinct to want retribution. Nietzsche thought that we all have a desire to cause suffering to others that we bury deep down inside us, and he actually thought there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, he thought it has several beneficial effects. The point of punishment, he said, was to make people remember. If you do something bad and you get hit for it, you'll remember it. And so, he says, the desire to cause suffering to one another is the foundation of all promises and contract and economic exchange and even reason itself. It makes people predictable and orderly, and hence it allows us to form goals and make plans based on the expectation that others will behave consistently. So painful, yes, but also kind of necessary. And that's a similar rationalization that I see some MAGA people making. And now... Jesus. J.D. Vance wrote a very interesting essay in 2020 called Why I Joined the Resistance. If you didn't know, Vance used to be a left-wing atheist, and now he's a far-right...
I did not know that. Vance used to be a left-wing atheist? I'm a left-wing atheist. What did I miss? Oh my gosh, I'm going to have to do a deep dive about that. I had no idea. Oh my God, I'm sick. I'm sick.
Right, Catholic, and the essay is about why that switch happened. In his essay, Vance says that the left often correctly diagnoses problems like poverty and addiction as structural. And yet, even in very privileged places like elite universities, there are plenty of people who have a lot of resources, who aren't poor, but are still addicted and depressed and stuck in a nihilist void, thrashing their lives away in pursuit of pointless prizes. And so, he says, in his opinion, America needs a spiritual renewal to fill that void. He likes that kind of solution because it gives people a chance for virtue. It's something they can individually reach for. They can make good choices, heroic choices even. Whereas the left tends to say, well, hey, here's a problem with society, and if you want to do something about it, too bad, this issue is systemic. And by the way, here's a list of words you can't say anymore. You don't really get to be a hero. You just avoid getting cancelled. And so we've lost our absolute values. We've lost our way, and this is very, very bad. Not only bad, in fact, it's apocalyptic. Every generation of anti-modernists has claimed that the current decadence is the last straw. If Obama wins, he'll make Christianity illegal. If Jeremy Corbyn wins, he'll never leave office. If the French Revolution sticks, Europe will devolve into anarchy. If the SJWs get their way, then video games will be taken away forever. And if the feminisms, then men? Forget about it. This is always more of a vibe than an argument. Anti-modernists have claimed for the last 200 years that society stands on the brink of nihilism and chaos, and they've been consistently wrong. But it is a very popular tune. Jordan Peterson? Absolutely.
I hate Jordan Peterson. I hate him. I'm sorry. That's not very lovey-dovey feminist of me. I hate it. Yeah, trigger warning. I'm already stressed. Fuck. I hate Jordan Peterson. All right.
Absolutely fits in here. You know how on YouTube now there's suddenly loads of videos about which video games and movies are woke or anti-woke, and there's this whole like DEI moral panic? That's anti-modernism too. It's all this anxiety about old values being questioned now that more people are getting included. When conservatives say that liberals are doing things like changing the meaning of the word woman and making it so you can't even speak the truth about biology anymore, that's anti-modernism too, you know? You're questioning the old ways. When manosphere misogynists say that women should be trad wives and men should be alphas, even though that doesn't seem to make either group happy. When conservatives say things like, oh, immigrants are coming in and they don't share our values and they're poisoning the blood of the nation, that's all anti-modernism too. You know, you're mixing things that shouldn't be mixed spiritually, morally, racially. Poisoning the blood, that was a phrase used by Friedrich Nietzsche and then by Adolf Hitler, and then by Donald Trump. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency and the British Conservative Party saying that there's too many woke DEI hire civil servants now, too many federal employees getting in the way of the will of the people, too much discussion, too much abstraction, too much questioning, not enough doing. Nietzsche said the exact same thing. He said that Germany had too many representatives and intermediaries in politics and not enough men of action. I mean, once you start reading it, it really is astonishing how much it's just the same thing. When anti-modernists go on this let's shrink the state crusade, they become natural allies of big corporations. Big corporations
Ew.
hate regulation and government because it cuts into their profits. So they team up. Elon Musk is the embodiment of that team up. The solution that anti-modernists pose is usually one of two things. Either we all have to become religious again, or we all have to embrace some kind of new values that don't include things like pluralism and freedom and discussion and democracy. In practice, though, it shakes out to the same thing: dictatorship. For anti-modernists, liberal democracy was a mistake that needs to be rolled back. And when anti-modernists team up with big corporations to take over the government, historians call that mix fascism. But here's why we can't just dismiss it as nihilism or madness, because there is a kind of void at the heart of society. Of course there is. We can feel it every day. I mean, check this out. Unless you win the lottery or you come from money, you're basically just a container for skills that employers want. At the drop of a hat, you might have to move cities, move countries, retrain, give up your artistic dreams, learn to code, take on debt, neglect your family, neglect your health, neglect your caring responsibilities, you know, disregard your heritage, lose your accent, and become indistinguishable from a billion other people, all trying to do the exact same thing, as interchangeable as nails in a fence post, all to make money, some of which is going to go to you, but most of which actually is going to go to your boss and your landlord and your insurance company if you're American. That is a kind of nihilism. That is against living. It's against human life. It doesn't make anyone feel good. I mean, it definitely happens if you're poor, but there are a lot of places like elite universities where there are plenty of people who are just burned out on how difficult it is to make a living. That is the way that the economy is organized, and it sucks. It sucked in Nietzsche's time, and it sucks even harder now. We should change this. In Nietzsche's universe, culture is downstream from politics, which is downstream from values, which is downstream from race. But a more accurate picture would be to say that everything is downstream from the way that the economy is organized, even our values. And we all have to compromise our values so often just to survive. And here's the final twist. The philosopher Wendy Brown says that in a theocracy, the government tells you who you have to be. Worship this god, value these things, follow these rules. But in a liberal democracy, the government doesn't do that. It doesn't tell you what you're supposed to value because you have things like separation of church and state and pursuit of happiness and a degree of individual liberty and so on. The idea is you bring your own values to life and you find out what they are by living it. Making a conscious choice about what you value out of life and what it is that you want, doing the kind of Nietzschean thing of becoming an individual and asserting yourself and claiming your own values, it's really, really difficult. It's scary. There's a lot of obstacles in the way. And what if it turns out that your values and the things that you want out of life aren't what mainstream society approves of? Well, then things can get a little difficult, believe me. So we get this tension between democratic nihilism, which is kind of by design and like kind of a good thing. It allows you room to grow as an individual and bring your own values to life. And on the other hand, we have capitalism running in and saying, I know what the answer is, you should value making a profit. And we have nationalism running in and saying, I know what you should value the nation. And we have racism running in and saying, I know what you should value the race. And we have religion running in and saying, I know what you should value the teachings in this book. And so there's this constant push and pull between democracy and anti-democracy going on all the time. Wow.
I think that the complexity, like, this is a really great breakdown of all of these different philosophies and ideas, starting with Nietzsche, ending up at the idea of a liberal democracy, all of this, like, this is a really great breakdown, but I think it's very indicative of how, with all of the different complexities, and we can see this especially on the left and like on the resistance side of any authoritarianism, any like even, conformism, and rigid institutionalization of control, any kind of resistance against all of these things, that there's a reason like why we see so much like fracturing or different variations of that resistance kind of like on the left, like, and that's why we get the messaging a lot from people on the left, like a lot of the top speakers on this side of these conversations saying stop punching sideways, punch upward, which is this idea of like infighting amongst ourselves as the quote unquote resistance against these authoritarian regimes or institutions of control. We should instead be punching up toward the elites who are orchestrating all of this, who are manufacturing all of this, so that they can continue profiting off of our exploitation. I think it's a really great point that all of this, as she says in Philosophy Tube here, all of this stems from capitalism, like essentially.
Really come a long way from my friend arguing with his daughter. I really wish I had a kind of pithy video essay answer to this problem that Wendy Brown identifies. That is kind of the Philosophy Tube way, isn't it? Like, hey, but here's the thing that you can do. Here's the John Oliver positive takeaway. But I really do think that tension is quite possibly one of the defining questions of the 21st century. So we are all going to find out the answer together in real time. Here's something that I thought of though when I was writing this episode. I have another friend who was born disabled, and a while ago I used the word freak in front of her to describe someone else, and she said to me, hey, like, that word really makes me feel bad, could you use something else? And just for a second I got mad in my head because I was like, obviously I wouldn't use the word freak to describe you. I would never use the word freak to describe somebody who was disabled. Like, stop telling me what to say. Obviously I would use it to describe someone who was weird. I wouldn't use it in that way. Like, why are you telling me that I'm bad? Why do you think that I'm bad? How could you think that about me? Just get off my back is what I thought. But then I reflected a little bit and I realized that using a different word probably wasn't going to impact me all that much. And by using that word, I was sort of throwing her off the balance of her day. I was like, putting a wrench in her system. And I could avoid doing that. So having reflected internally, I made the choice to bump that word down the list of my vocabulary. I made her life a little easier, and that decision came from me. So I enhanced her freedom, and I also used my freedom. It wasn't a will to power trick. She wasn't trying to will to power me, and I wasn't trying to get like woke brownie points by using my will to power to kind of virtue signal to her. It was just, we enhanced our freedom together. Anti-modernism and Nietzsche are both pretty individualistic. And that's where I think it kind of falls down. This is what I was saying. Individualization is kind of its own downfall, but it's still, it's tricky because I think, again, especially for women, individualization is the balancing act of fighting against being just having to be horizontally energetic and always having to be caretakers and putting other people's emotions first and being the nurturing side of the equation all of the time. I think it's important for women to step into their ego to balance out the kind of the softening of the ego from our male counterpart in order to kind of find an equilibrium amongst each other. So again, like a lot of the rhetoric of previous philosophers and all of these things, individualization, self-actualization has been so prioritized, especially in Western culture. And it's just something to keep an eye out for when you're like reading any self-help books. Like, come to it from a perspective of, have I spent my life being actually being the doormat for other people, kind of as a woman, or have I been living in a system that props up who I am so easily, and tells me that
I can't be vulnerable and I can't have emotions and all of these, and I have to be the sole provider and all of this pressure that is on men, so that maybe the balancing act and the equilibrium solution for that would be to focus less on individualization and more on community building. So that's a really great point.
Individual thing, that to me feels a little bit like being on a treadmill, because even if you become the great individual and you achieve everything and you become so dominant and strong, like who do you have to share it with? I mean, you know, look at a guy like Elon Musk. He has so much and he's miserable. He's the richest man in the world, but like, you know, ketamine's not that expensive. Nobody who accomplished anything worthwhile ever managed it on their own, and not everybody who challenges us is trying to pull some kind of will to power virtue signaling trick on us. Sometimes they're just trying to grow too. I mean, here's my hot take. That's why I kind of like pluralism and modernism and individual freedom, because we all have the potential to grow and change in unexpected ways. We have the potential to do it together too, and that's why I like that the government doesn't tell me what to believe or what God to worship, because, you know, who knows what you could turn out to be. That's how I think of it anyway. It's not really a conclusion, it's more just a, hey, that's something that occurred to me when I was writing this. I think it's good that society doesn't just produce clones of the same person all the time, you know. I think it's good that everyone's not just NPCs. And speaking of NPCs, I actually wrote a part 3 to this Nietzsche series. It's about a video game called The Outer Worlds, and how it helps me confront nihilism. Like a lot of people, I've been feeling the nihilist void lately.
So that was a really good video. I think that the answer to was Nietzsche MAGA is essentially kind of yes, but maybe in a different context, like studying Nietzsche and where Nietzsche was in relation to his own time and culture is more of a stepping stone away from MAGA, if that makes sense. That's kind of how I took the perspective of this really great video. Thank you, Philosophy Tube. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did.